The hallway that led to the vault was different from the rest of Paisley Park. No purple lights, no gold records on the walls, no photographs of prints with presidents or rock stars or legends. Just plain walls, industrial carpet, and a door at the end that looked more like a bank vault than anything that should exist in a recording studio. Marcus had walked past that door hundreds of times during his night shifts, always locked, always silent, always giving off the vibe of a space that didn't want to be disturbed. But on this particular March night in 2015, at exactly 3:17 in the morning, according to the timestamp on his security log, Marcus heard something coming from behind that vault door that made him stop mid-stride and question whether he was imagining things. Music. Live music. Piano, specifically, played with the kind of technical precision that could only come from someone who'd spent their entire life mastering the instrument. But it was the emotion in the playing that froze Marcus in place, made him forget about his rounds, his training, the rules he'd been following for 3 years. These weren't notes. They were pain made audible, grief translated into sound, a private conversation between a man and the ghost of someone who would never hear it. Marcus moved closer to the door, knowing he shouldn't, unable to stop himself, and in the narrow gap between the door and the frame, he could see a sliver of light, and in that light, a silhouette sitting at a piano, and he knew without question who it was, and he knew without question that he was witnessing something the world was never supposed to see. If you want to discover the untold moments that reveal who Prince really was behind the legend, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the truth hidden in the vault. Marcus Johnson had been working night security at Paisley Park for 3 years and 2 months when that March night changed everything he thought he understood about the job. The job came with strict rules. Don't touch anything. Don't take photos. Don't talk to press. And most importantly, if you see Prince working, you pretend you saw nothing. Marcus had followed these rules perfectly for 3 years. He'd seen things over the years that would have made headlines. All-night sessions, famous faces, intense rehearsals. But Marcus kept his mouth shut. Paisley Park was massive. 55,000 square feet. During the day it hummed with activity. At night, it was silent and empty. The vault was located in a part of the building that most people never saw, accessed through a series of hallways that dead-ended at that bank vault-style door. Marcus had been told during his training that the vault contained Prince's unreleased music, thousands of recordings that had never been heard by the public, organized according to a system that only Prince himself understood. The door was always locked, the hallway was always empty, and in 3 years Marcus had never seen anyone go in or come out. It was just another part of the building to check during his rounds, another locked door to verify, another space that existed in the background of his nightly routine. Until that March night when everything changed. That night started normally. Marcus arrived at 10 p.m., began his rounds. Prince's car was in the garage, but the building was silent. By 3 a.m., Marcus had completed 2 full rounds of the building and was starting his 3rd when he approached the hallway that led to the vault. This was normally the quietest part of his route, a dead-end corridor that required only a quick visual check before moving on to the next section. But tonight, something was different. Sound. Faint at first, almost too quiet to identify, but definitely there. Music coming from behind the vault door. Marcus stopped. Unexpected sounds meant security issues. He moved closer. Live music. Piano played with incredible precision. The melody was haunting, repetitive, searching for something in the notes. The vault door wasn't completely closed. There was a gap, maybe an inch wide, just enough to let sound escape and let a thin slice of light cut through the darkness of the hallway. Marcus knew he should call it in. Radio the main security office, report that someone had accessed a restricted area. But something in the music stopped him. made him pause with his hand halfway to his radio, listening to sounds that seemed to carry more emotion than should be physically possible for arranged notes to contain. In the center of the room sat an upright piano, and at that piano sat Prince, still wearing the clothes he'd worn earlier in the day, his back to the door, his fingers moving across the keys with the kind of muscle memory that comes from a lifetime of practice. But it was what Marcus heard in the playing that made him forget about protocol, about rules, about everything except the overwhelming sadness that seemed to pour out of that piano like something physical, something that could be measured and weighed. This wasn't Prince the performer. This wasn't the carefully controlled public figure who commanded stadiums and dominated MTV. This was a man alone with his grief, playing music that sounded like it was tearing him apart from the inside. Marcus stood there for over an hour. Prince played the same song repeatedly, sometimes stopping midway, sometimes just sitting still, lost in private grief. At one point, Prince stopped playing altogether and just sat there at the piano, his shoulders hunched forward, his head bowed, and Marcus realized he was crying. Quiet sobs that barely made sound, but that shook his whole body with their intensity. Marcus felt like he was intruding on something sacred, violating some unspoken boundary between public and private grief. But he couldn't make himself walk away, couldn't tear his attention from the scene playing out in that climate-controlled room full of unreleased music and unfinished dreams. Around 4:30, Prince stopped playing. He moved to a filing cabinet and searched through master tapes until he found what he needed. Eventually, Prince found what he was looking for: a tape in a white box with handwriting on the label that Marcus couldn't read from the doorway. Prince held it for a long time, just staring at it. And then something happened that Marcus would replay in his mind for years afterward. Prince brought the tape to his chest, held it there like it was something precious and fragile, and whispered something that Marcus couldn't hear but could see in the movement of his lips. Then he put the tape back in its place on the shelf, returned to the piano, and started playing again. The song was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. Later, he'd learned the vault contained more than unreleased albums. It held Prince's most personal work. It also contained Prince's most personal work, the songs he'd written about his son, Boy Gregory, the child who had lived for only 7 days in October 1996 before dying from complications related to Pfeiffer syndrome. Those songs had never been released, would probably never be released, because they were too raw, too honest, too painful for Prince to share with a world that expected entertainment from him, not unfiltered grief. The tape Prince had pulled from the shelf and held against his chest was one of those recordings, Marcus would later realize. One of the Boy Gregory songs. One of the pieces of music that Prince had created not for albums or concerts or commercial success, but as a way of processing a loss so devastating it had destroyed his marriage to Mayte and fundamentally changed who he was as a person. The vault wasn't just an archive of unreleased music. It was a mausoleum for a future that never happened. A library of what-ifs and might-have-beens, organized and cataloged and locked away, where no one could access it without Prince's permission. And on this particular March night in 2015, Prince had come to this room the way some people visit grave sites, seeking some kind of connection with someone who was gone, playing music that served as both memorial and mourning, both remembrance and release. Marcus understood, standing in that dark hallway, that he was witnessing the private cost of being Prince Rogers Nelson. The public saw the genius, the hits, the legendary performances, the carefully constructed image of an artist who controlled every aspect of his career. But here, in this climate-controlled room at 3 a.m, was the reality behind the image. A father who had never stopped grieving for his son. A man who carried a pain so profound that even unlimited creative talent couldn't transform it into something bearable. The music Prince played that night wasn't meant for an audience. It wasn't meant to be heard or analyzed or appreciated. It was meant to be a private conversation with a ghost, a way of keeping someone alive through sound when every other way of keeping them had failed. Around 5 in the morning, something shifted in the music. Prince had been playing variations on the same theme for over an hour when suddenly the chord progression changed, became something lighter, almost hopeful, a major key resolution that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Marcus, still standing by the door, felt the change in his chest before he consciously recognized it in the notes. The grief was still there, the loss was still present, but something else had entered the music too. Acceptance, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. A recognition that pain doesn't have to be the only thing that defines a memory. Prince played this new section twice, then stopped and sat very still at the piano. When he finally stood up, his movements were different, less weighted, as if the music had accomplished something that nothing else could. He walked to the filing cabinet one more time, pulled out that same white tape box, and this time when he looked at it, Marcus could see something different in his posture, in the way he held himself. Not healed, Marcus would think later, but maybe healing, or at least trying to. Prince put the tape back in its place, turned off the light above the piano, and began moving toward the door. Marcus realized with sudden panic that he was about to be discovered, that Prince would open the door and find his security guard standing in the hallway, obviously having witnessed the most private moment imaginable. There was nowhere to hide, no way to pretend he'd just arrived. No explanation that would make this anything other than what it was. An intrusion, a violation of the trust that his entire job was built on. Marcus stood frozen, watching through the gap in the door as Prince moved closer, prepared to lose his job, prepared for anger or disappointment or whatever reaction was about to come. But when Prince reached the door and pulled it open, he didn't seem surprised to find Marcus standing there. He looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable behind the ever-present sunglasses, even at 5 in the morning. And then he did something that Marcus never could have predicted. He nodded, just once, a small acknowledgement of shared humanity, a recognition that some moments are too heavy to carry alone, even if you're Prince. Then he walked past Marcus without a word, his footsteps silent on the industrial carpet, and disappeared down the hallway toward his private quarters. Marcus stood there for another few minutes, shaking slightly, trying to process what had just happened. He'd been caught witnessing something he wasn't supposed to see. And instead of anger or consequences, he'd received that single nod, that moment of acknowledgement that said more than words ever could. I know you were there. I know what you heard. And I'm choosing to trust that you'll keep this between us. Marcus finished his shift in a daze. He filed his standard report, all clear, routine night. He didn't mention the vault. The secret was his to carry. Marcus never spoke about what he'd witnessed, not to his co-workers, not to his family, not to anyone. The secret became part of who he was. A weight he carried that reminded him that behind every public figure, behind every carefully constructed image, was a human being dealing with pain and loss and grief in whatever ways they could manage. When Prince died 13 months later, in April 2016, from an accidental fentanyl overdose, Marcus was one of the security guards who had to secure Paisley Park as it transformed from private residence to crime scene to public memorial. He walked past the vault door dozens of times in those chaotic days, and every time he did, he thought about that March night, about the music he'd heard, about the grief that Prince had carried so privately that even most of the people who worked for him never knew the full extent of it. When Prince's estate was finally settled and the contents of the vault were cataloged for the first time by people other than Prince himself, they found exactly what longtime employees had always suspected. thousands of unreleased recordings, enough music for dozens of albums, a lifetime of creative output that the world had never heard. Among those recordings were the songs about Boy Gregory, the ones that Prince had never been able to bring himself to release, the ones that were too honest and too painful to share with an audience that expected entertainment from him, not raw grief. Some of those songs would eventually be released posthumously, carefully selected by estate managers and family members, trying to honor Prince's legacy while respecting his privacy. But others would remain locked away, protected by the same secrecy that Prince had maintained during his lifetime, private conversations with a ghost that were never meant for public consumption. Marcus thought about those songs sometimes, wondered if the one he'd heard that March night was among the ones that had been released, or if it was still in the vault, still serving its original purpose as private memorial rather than public art. He thought about Prince sitting at that piano at 3 a.m, playing music that would never make him money or win him awards or add to his legend, playing simply because it was the only way he knew how to maintain connection with someone who was gone. And he thought about that moment when Prince had opened the vault door and found Marcus standing there, and instead of anger or disappointment, had given him that single nod of acknowledgement, that brief recognition of shared humanity that said more than any conversation could have conveyed. Years after that night, after Prince's death and the public mourning and the endless analysis of his legacy, Marcus would sometimes be asked what it was like to work at Paisley Park, what Prince was really like behind the carefully constructed public image. He never told the full story, never violated the trust that had been placed in him that March morning when Prince had chosen acknowledgement over anger, understanding over consequences. But he would say this, that Prince was human in ways that his legend sometimes obscured, that the same creative genius that produced Purple Rain and Sign of the Times also produced private music that would never be heard, and that some of the most important songs ever written were important not because of who heard them, but because of why they needed to be written in the first place. The vault at Paisley Park still exists, still contains thousands of unreleased recordings, still represents decades of creative output that the world is only beginning to understand. But for Marcus, the vault would always be something else too. The place where he learned that genius and grief can coexist, that public strength can mask private pain, and that sometimes the most profound music is played not for applause or recognition, but simply as a way of surviving another night, another hour, another moment of missing someone who will never come back. The song Prince played that March night in 2015 was never released, may never be released, might remain in that climate-controlled room forever, serving its original purpose as private memorial rather than public performance. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Maybe some music isn't meant to be shared. Maybe some conversations with ghosts are too sacred for outside ears. Marcus kept the secret even after Prince was gone. Some moments are too intimate for stories, some grief too private to share. And in the end, maybe that's what the vault was really for. Not to store unreleased albums or protect commercial interests, but to give Prince a space where he could be completely honest, completely vulnerable, completely human, without worrying about image or expectations or anything, except the simple act of remembering someone who deserved to be remembered. In music that would never fade, never be forgotten, never stop playing in the private spaces where love and loss and grief live forever.